Good afternoon. My name is Myron Randall. I'm the Associate Director of Recruitment and Community Engagement here at Mercer University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you once again to Mercer University's Professional Development Series. This is our attempt to educate you and connect with you during the midst of seems to be an uncertain time. So we know right now in the world there is this viral contagion that is going all around the world, but today we want to look at something a little bit different. We want to talk about emotional contagion. We want to find out what that means and how to harness that power. And to do that, I have got a dear friend with me, Dr. Juanita Forrester. I can't say your name, excuse me. Dr. Juanita Forrester, who is a professor of management here in the Stetson-Hatcher School of Business here at Mercer University. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to have you today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we love this. And I guess to start this off, tell us a little bit about you. How'd you get to Mercer? How long you've been at Mercer? And how'd you discover this topic?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the introduction, Myron. So I am an assistant professor of management here at Mercer University. I have been here for about 3 years now, and I teach courses across the management discipline. So that includes human resources, organizational behavior. I also teach a negotiations class. And the way that my thinking has evolved around this topic is I've done research really that ranges quite a few different areas. So I've done research on diversity, on entrepreneurship, and the way that I see my research trajectory kind of heading now is really in a way that kind of helps us explore our inner lives. So I'm particularly interested in emotions and well-being at work, meaning, purpose. So anything having to do with how we psychologically process our workplace experiences. And I felt like this topic of emotional contagion is especially relevant now, given everything that's going on in the world.
Well, I'm excited to hear more about this. And folks, for those of you watching, we want your questions. We welcome your questions. So there is a question and answer button down in the chat. So if you have a question at any point during this presentation, feel free to send that in to us and we'll address those throughout the presentation. But until then, I will drop off and I will let you take the stage, Dr. Forrester. And I look forward to learning a little bit more from you today.
Great. Thank you so much, Myron. Okay. So the topic of my talk is Keep Calm, Harnessing the Power of Emotional Contagion. So I just wanted to start off with this quote that is probably familiar to many of you on the call, and it is, "No man is an island unto himself." And the reason why I chose this quote to start off with is I think it's a really useful concept to reflect on. So although we are currently in a moment in history where so many of us feel alone and disconnected from each other, really we are inherently social beings. So what that means is we really are wired to seek out connections with others. And as a result of those attempts, that really formulates the lens that we use to experience and understand the world around us. So even though right now, it's a time that's full of uncertainty, so many of us are experiencing unprecedented levels of fear, anxiety, stress, due to a variety of reasons, right? And we're seeing that in our social networks too. But now more than ever, I also feel as though this is an amazing opportunity for all of us to begin thinking with more intention about what's really going on in our emotional lives and how we can ultimately take better care of ourselves and also each other. So I just want to start off by saying a little bit about what emotion actually is. So emotion is kind of one of those concepts that we throw around pretty loosely, but I'm not sure that we take the time to really reflect on what it refers to. And in doing so, oftentimes we often miss the complexity of what emotion involves. So I pulled this definition really from the dictionary, and it defines emotion as a natural instinctive state of mind deriving from one's circumstances, mood, or relationship with others. And emotion is really a state of arousal that includes many facets. So when we experience an emotion, you see that reflected in our facial expressions, right? You see that it reflected in our posture, the way that we carry ourselves, and even physiologically speaking. So if I'm feeling happy, right, the corners of my mouth are going to turn up, my eyes might get wider, you know, my eyebrows might raise up. So all of those are indicators of emotion, but they also help to feed the way that we make sense of that emotion. There's also brain activation. So we know from neurological studies that when people feel emotions, there's a lot going on in your brain, right? There's a lot of signals that are being fired off. There are a lot of different centers that are lighting up. There's communication and connections that are happening between neurons in our brain. There's also cognitive appraisals. So when we experience emotion, we really try to make sense of it, right? So we try to tell ourselves a story about what we're going through. And that's our way of kind of naming and labeling our experiences. And another way of thinking about that is a cognitive appraisal. We also have subjective feelings. So it's not just naming it, right? So that might look differently from person to person. And so for that reason, we also understand emotion as inherently subjective, right? So my experience of happiness is not going to have the same origin, and it may not even have the same expression as someone else. We also have tendencies toward action. So sometimes we don't think this far along, but the way that we behave in response to the emotions that we feel is another indicator of that emotional experience. So if I'm the kind of person where as soon as I get angry, you know, there's a heightening of my tone of voice or my volume goes up, right? That would be considered a behavioral reaction. And that's a part of that experience of emotion. It's very critical. So what is emotional contagion? So emotional contagion is really what it sounds like. It refers to emotional transmission from person to person. So if you are observing someone feeling an emotion and you then in turn feel that same emotion, that's what we term emotional contagion. So I know that many of us have probably had this experience of seeing a friend yawn, right? And you're like, I don't know why, but I just have to yawn too. That's emotional contagion. I know for me personally, if I'm out and about, maybe running errands, and I catch the eye of a baby or a small child, and they're smiling or laughing at me, I automatically feel a sense of positivity. It just surges through me, and I'm going to return that smile. I'm going to laugh along with them, right? So I'm catching that feeling. So where exactly do we catch these feelings? Well, we're exposed to emotions everywhere. So it's what you hear, people you spend time with, so discussions that we're having with our friends and family. A lot of us are working from home, right? So it could even be coworkers, conversations that we're having virtually on Zoom. But it's also more than the actual people in our lives. It's also what we watch. So it's really anything that we kind of expose ourselves to. It could be TV, movies, the emotional content of commercials. All of those forms of media contain emotional messages that we're picking up on. I think that many people are kind of surprised to learn that emotional contagion does take so many forms. It's even something that's transmitted via social media, for instance. So what you're reading, right? So that could be news, it could be books, it could even be emails from a coworker. So if I open up my email and I'm getting a coworker's email, I'm wired to try to detect and look for cues as to how that coworker was feeling when they wrote that. So I might ask myself, was my coworker irritated? Were they frustrated about something? There's going to be emotional content in that message, even though the message only contains words, right? And we actually do pick up on these things. Okay, so I wanted to share this study with you all, and it really is a groundbreaking study. Many people in this area cite it over and over again, and I think it's because the results of this study were so fascinating and so far-reaching. So the Framingham Heart Study was a longitudinal research project. It spanned a period of 20 years. And what they found is that happiness extends up to 3 degrees of separation. So if you're happy, your close friends are 25% more likely to report high levels of happiness. And the way researchers measured this is they tracked emotional reports of participants repeatedly over a period of time. And so they might ask something like, how often, this week were you feeling happy? How often this week were you feeling uplifted? Versus how often were you feeling down? How often were you feeling sad, right? And what they found is that we can predict what people are feeling based really on their social network. So close friends, it's a 25% linkage. Even a friend of that close friend without any interaction with that original source of emotions is 10% more likely to report more feelings of joy if one person, that focal person, is incredibly happy. And then it extends even an additional degree. So a friend of that friend will claim to experience 5.6% more happiness. So as we can see from this study, emotional contagion can really have very wide-reaching effects. And I think that emotional contagion spreads way more than we really realize. So how does emotional contagion occur? So from a micro level perspective, we can kind of start to analyze how we pick up on each other's feelings. Here, I think it's important to note that mimicry is actually one of the very first languages that we learn as infants. And it's really a way that infants begin to learn about the world around them. So many young people subconsciously learn to imitate facial expressions, postures, and even the voices of the people that they're surrounded by. And as I kind of mentioned in passing earlier, our body actually internalizes those expressions. So whenever we copy someone's smile, for instance, our brain actually registers that as an emotion that we feel ourselves, okay? And so that's kind of this feedback loop that we observe where that emotion is catching. Okay, so I also wanted to share with you all this stress study. This study was conducted by the Max Planck Institute for Cognitive and Brain Sciences, and participants were brought into a lab and they were asked to observe strangers taking a test. And so this test was not something, that was simple, elementary. It really included really difficult mental arithmetic. It included interviews. And not only were they asked to do these tasks that the average person would break a sweat when being asked to do, but analysts were also right there with a notebook rating their performance. So they were actively being evaluated by experts. And so you can imagine this is a very stressful situation, but researchers designed this, right, to do research. And what they found is that 30% of people who observed a participant who was asked to do this really difficult test and also being evaluated while they're doing it had a cortisol increase. On top of that, 24% of those watching a video, so you might think, okay, if I'm watching this through a one-way mirror, it's happening in real time, right? It's immersive. It's like I'm right there. But even when participants were watching the video, they knew in their minds that this was an incident that happened prior to, right? And they still actually saw that cortisol levels were increased. And cortisol is a stress hormone, right, that we can measure in your blood. So this study is actually really impactful and meaningful because it suggests that when we're observing the emotions of other people, the way that we interpret that goes beyond imagining how they might feel in that given situation. And we can actually observe physiological effects, right? So if I see somebody who's stressed out, even though I'm under no amount of stress myself, we can still imagine situations where the cortisol levels in my blood will increase. And so that's a really fascinating finding because it shows that there are physiological imprints to these experiences. Okay, so another study I wanted to share with you, I thought this was really interesting, particularly now because so many of us, I think spend more time on social media or spending more time in the internet because we're quarantined, right? And so this is a way that we kind of use to kind of reach out to one another. But in 2014, some of you may have heard about this study. It was a really famous experiment, mostly because it was unethical. Users had no idea that they were actually a part of this study. But Facebook actually looked at almost 700,000 users, and they used a system to identify positive versus negative words. And what they did was they manipulated the news feeds of these Facebook users, and they reduced the amount of positive content in some people's feeds and reduced the amount of negative content in another group. Results actually showed that users' status updates reflected whatever the manipulation condition was that they were in. So, in other words, the participants who saw less positive content on their newsfeed were actually more likely to then go in and write a status update that included negative emotion, so negatively fueled words, right? So this was a really groundbreaking study because it was one of the largest scale, right? And one of the first to show that social media is actually incredibly influential when it comes to how we feel, to the point where, not only are we just passively kind of absorbing whatever it is that we see, we're also then modifying our behaviors based on that emotional input. Okay, so when we talk about emotional contagion, I think it's important to remember that emotional contagion really evolved as a critical survival skill. So we're really wired to pick up on others' emotions as a way to ensure our safety, protection, and survival as human beings. So you might imagine yourself, out and about, and maybe you see a few people who are coming out of a store and they look upset, they look distressed, maybe they look helpless, right? You are probably not going to go into that store. We might imagine a more vivid example where you see a crowd of people outside running. If you're on the ground seeing groups of people running in one direction, chances are you're not going to go the opposite way to try to determine why these people are running, right? You're going to run along with them. And so we can see how emotional contagion really works as a function to keep us safe. Beyond that, emotional contagion allows for group coordination and synchronization. It also allows for empathy and understanding, right? So when we kind of mimic the emotions of others, it helps us better connect with them, right? And that actually leads to more cohesive bonds, more trust, right? And then we're more likely to kind of act as a unit and protect one another. It's also a method of learning and adaptation. So going back to the infant example, right? Infants learn kind of what's exciting, what's maybe dangerous, right? Based on the expressions and the body language of the people around them. And then we also know just on a basic level that there's safety and strength in numbers, right? So there's a reason why we reach out to connect with each other in this way. So even though emotional contagion definitely has its purpose as a way to keep us safe, a way to protect us so that ultimately we're surviving, right? There are definitely some risks to picking up on emotions and kind of putting yourself into the survival mode. The first risk that I want to talk about is called negative bias. And here, this really refers to the danger or the possibility that because we're so hardwired to pick up on environmental threats, we're also susceptible to interpreting things negatively. And what would that mean, right? It means that we could actually pick up on something that isn't truly there to begin with. We create realities with our belief systems. And, this is some of the subjectivity that I referred to earlier. So, we may only know half the story, right? So if we only tune into someone's emotional expression, we may not see their body language. If we're reading an email, right, we often don't have the appropriate context to truly know and have that 100% accuracy as to what that person was feeling. So we're constantly kind of making assumptions and trying to decode things. And they could be our determinations of what others are feeling can be more or less accurate, right? They're not always 100% correct. You might also imagine a scenario where maybe in the past you had a supervisor who was abusive. They were mean, they called you names, they constantly yelled at you. Even if you had this supervisor 5, 10 years ago in the past, if you are at your current job and you get a new manager, and that person is maybe dressing the same way as your previous supervisor. They're using the same words. Maybe they even have the same haircut, right? We can be triggered by those things because we all have our own collection of emotionally resonant and sometimes traumatizing experiences. And so there is the possibility of kind of projecting into the present. So it's important to kind of lead with openness and curiosity, right? We don't always know what's happening. And so we always want to try to collect more information before reacting. There's also the risk of compassion fatigue. And so compassion fatigue, I think that this is a really big thing for all of us to think about now. I think that care and compassion, especially during a time like this, which is very much a crisis situation, it can be really important and powerful, right, for us to demonstrate care towards our loved ones, especially those that are suffering, especially those that are dealing with depression and anxiety, for instance. However, at the same time, it's really important for us to not to forget that we need to take care of ourselves, right? And there is a risk of overloading yourself, not just with your own stresses, but with other people's as well. And we can come to a point of exhaustion. Every one of us has our limits. And so I'll talk a little bit more about how we can kind of, create boundaries. But I think that this is also a huge risk that all of us needs to think about and be mindful of. Okay, so in addition to those two kind of specialized concepts I discussed, there's also more general long-term health risks to absorbing negative emotions in particular from our environment, from our media, or from the people that we're spending time with. And these risks are pretty substantial. So there's stress, anxiety, depression. All those things can develop if we have a cumulative experience of stress and negative emotions. There's also physical and mental strain, so we could burn out at work. We also know that insomnia is a possibility. So, a lot of people have an experience of staying up all night, right? Like running through events in their head. And sometimes that's your own source of anxiety. Sometimes it can really be connected to how you perceived other people's emotions, right? And so we can really take that on and absorb that. You're also at an increased risk of physiological health disorders, so heart disease, diabetes, really any physical disorder that you can think of that comes about as the result of stress. Okay, so what increases contagion? Well, there are a few things, right, that determine whether or not we're going to pick up on the emotions that are around us. One thing is perceived closeness and connection. So we know from the research that we're more connected to people that we perceive as close to us. So what that means is you're more likely to pick up on the emotions of your spouse, maybe your parents, maybe your siblings or your children even, right? So family members, because we feel that sense of closeness and connection, we're kind of tuned into them. There's also level of intensity of observed emotion. So here I just want to speak quickly about another research finding on social media that has actually shown that the more emotionally engaging a post is, as in it may mention feelings of anger or upset, the more likely people are to share that post. And then also the more likely people are to report feeling the feelings that are expressed via that post. So for instance, if I have a friend who posts a news story about the shelves at the grocery store being empty, and then I have another friend who posts the same link, the same exact story, but they actually caption it by talking about how upset they are, how angry they are that they can't find toilet paper at any store, right? Because my second friend's post was emotionally charged, as in contained more emotional language, I'm more likely to share that post. And I'm also more likely to say, I actually feel the same way that she does, right? Because there's an emotional intensity that you're observing there. There's also sensitivity to others' emotions. So some of us are really kind of tuned into the world around us. Some people might consider themselves to be very empathic, right? And so it makes sense, right? The more empathic you are, the more likely you're going to be attentive and kind of be alert when it comes to reading the emotions of the people that you're spending time with. So there's also high reactivity to one's own emotional experiences. So if I am triggered by something, something's making me really upset, and I act on that, right? So I do something, I throw something, I yell, there's something that I do, right, immediately. You might think of this in terms of impulsivity. The more likely I am to pick up on emotions. And, this makes sense too, right? When we consider our mind-body connection that I referred to earlier. When I'm kind of acting on those feelings, my brain is being told that I'm feeling those feelings. So it's a feedback loop, and it can be a cycle that we get stuck in. And it's the perpetuation of that emotion. Okay, so I've talked a lot about emotional contagion, what it is.
This is
Myron?
fascinating. Like, I really feel like you've given us language here. So I've always known that you can get emotion or catch emotion from somebody else, but I never understood the term. So this is incredibly fascinating. There are some questions though. So let me ask some questions from our audience folks. So the question is, who do we catch emotions from? Are they from our friends or from random strangers? Where does it come from?
Yeah, that's a great question, Myron. So we are more likely to catch emotions from people that we're close to, but research also suggests that we catch emotions from people who remind us of ourselves, right? So if there's any point of similarity, if there's any point of connection, as I mentioned, if it's somebody that you already have a relationship with, a friendship with, then you're more likely to catch that emotion. But I also mentioned there's other factors involved with that, right? So if I have a greater level of sensitivity, then it's more likely that I'm catching feelings from everyone, including strangers, including people that I don't necessarily have that close relationship with. So it varies, yeah.
So then I guess the next question is, and this is again from the folks that are watching, how do I protect myself against this emotional contagion? If I'm able to catch it from anybody and be impacted by lots of people's different emotions and feelings, how do I protect myself in that way?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. And I'm so glad you asked that because it actually fits very well with my next slide.
Right. Well, I'm going to let you keep going, and I will be back at the end to ask more questions.
Great. Thank you, Myron. So Myron asked a really interesting question from the audience, and it's how do I know if I'm catching feelings, or how do I reduce my susceptibility, right? And so I actually think those questions go hand in hand with one another. And there's actually a list of skills that are involved with kind of recognizing when you're catching emotions. And that awareness is really kind of the first step at helping us protect ourselves, right? When we know that those negative emotions are things that we want to keep over there, right? We don't want to take in everything. So I want to talk a little bit about emotional intelligence. And Goleman, actually, Daniel Goleman, he really is responsible for what we might consider to be an affective revolution that we've seen in workplace research. So studies actually suggest that EQ is a very strong predictor of success. In the past, organizational studies were super interested in IQ. IQ predicts everything. You know, IQ is how you can tell if your employee is going to be a great performer. IQ is how you can tell if the leaders in your company are as effective as they can be, right? But what we've actually seen in more recent years is this shift in organizational research to really consider more about emotional skills. There are four factors of emotional intelligence. There's self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. So, you know, if I had longer, I would talk all day about these four factors. There's tons of interesting stuff to learn about them, and they're all incredibly important. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on self-awareness and self-management. I really feel as though those are foundational to actually influencing how we interact with others. And I also think that emotional intelligence is something that is really can be empowering for us to discuss today, because in the midst of so many things that feel outside of our control, emotional intelligence is actually a skill that can be improved. So the more we actually practice developing our EQ, we can actually become stronger as a result of this effort, and therefore better equipped to manage all the uncertainty, all the stress that comes along with what we're currently experiencing, right? Okay, so first I want to talk a little bit about self-awareness, and it is the ability to recognize and understand your moods, emotions, and drives. So many of us are used to just simply living on autopilot. And we don't often take the time to kind of check in with ourselves and ask, you know, what is it that we're feeling? And it makes sense, right? We learn all these things in school about skills that are needed in the workplace, but very rarely, I mean, I think it's only up until very recently, have we started to see traditional paradigms that bring attention to how we can detect our emotions and how to actually manage those emotions. Okay, so this is a practice I wanted to share with you. I think this is something that is really, really useful. It can be very, very valuable, and it seems simple, but again, it's just such a powerful practice. It's an activity called just doing a body scan. And, you know, for those of us on the call that have practiced meditation or really any kind of mindfulness, this should be something that is somewhat familiar to you. So body scan is really checking in with yourself, and the whole purpose is we want to increase the strength of that mind-body connection. So you might ask yourself, how am I feeling? You know, how is my body feeling right now? Then it can be useful to ask yourself, how strong is that feeling? So for many of us, being able to quantify that feeling, is it a 9? Is it a 3? Is it a 5? That can really help us appreciate that in-between space, right? So we can also start to begin to see, are there certain things that trigger me, right? So take me automatically to a 9, to a 10. Those are the things that we wanna, you know, pay particular attention to. Also, another question to ask is, where do I feel the sensation in my body? So is it in my chest? Is it in my stomach? Is it in my head? Do I feel a heaviness, right? So where in my body am I feeling this? And notice too, we're not necessarily jumping to labeling that feeling. Really, we're just focused on the sensation, right? So this can be super, super general. It can be a heaviness. That's fine, but it's informative too. Finally, we might ask ourselves, what physical sensations do I notice in my body? So we can start to begin to name those sensations, not in the sense of a specific emotion, but more in the sense of what am I feeling? So do I feel warm? You know, what's the temperature, right? Do I feel hot? Do I feel cold? Do I feel emptiness? Do I feel a tingling, right? So I think a really popular way of talking about even like nervousness or anxiety, and sometimes even excitement, is butterflies in your stomach. So we're familiar with that kind of reference of feeling something like a fluttering, like phenomena, right? So I think that, you know, this is a really useful activity because each of us feels feelings very differently. And so it's really important to kind of get to know yourself, really. That's where the value comes in. And by taking the time to kind of check in with how you're feeling, you can, again, strengthen that connection between your body and your mind. And I also think it's just important to kind of give justice to the way that your feelings in particular manifest themselves, because it may not be the same for everyone. At the same time, I wanted to share this little diagram with you all because I think it's really fascinating, right? Although we each have our own unique experiences of emotions, researchers actually asked people, what do you feel when you feel blank emotion? And what they found was that there were some patterns that emerged. So if you just want to speak generally, you can see from the diagram here that happiness and love is something that people report feeling warmth all throughout their bodies, right? So everywhere. Those are two of the most all-consuming emotions. This is in contrast to feelings such as anger, right? So anger is really interesting because people report feeling anger really in their upper body, in their arms, and it's one of the only emotions that shows up that way for people consistently. And this is in contrast also to feelings such as depression or even contempt, right? You can see for contempt, people say they feel it in their head, but the rest of their body, they feel nothing. And then depression, right, is more of kind of a feeling of emptiness, of coldness. So I think our body, like just being in tune with it, can start to give us a lot of clues about what's happening internally. Okay, so here's another useful activity that I think is a great way to kind of build on this body scan. And this is where, distinct from the previous activity, we're starting to label our emotions. And so I know for me, when I first started looking at feelings wheels or emotions wheels, I was really surprised at the range of emotions that we often don't put a name to, but I'm sure many of us feel, right? So this is something, you know, this is one feeling wheel that I thought was a good representative, but if you're interested, you can Google, there are many, many versions of this. And really, you start by trying to label your emotions. And then you might take the time to write about what you're feeling. And here's where we kind of get into what is it that has triggered this feeling in me? Where is it coming from? And by kind of reviewing that work, journaling it for ourselves, we can begin to recognize patterns. I want to just also emphasize that in doing this activity and also doing the previous one, it's so, so important for us to come to ourselves with an attitude of curiosity, openness, and ultimate compassion, right? One reason why I think this activity is so useful and so empowering is because whether we realize it or not, we're navigating a world that's full of implicit and then sometimes explicit rules as far as, you know, what is it appropriate emotion to display, right? So for many of us, You know, you might feel embarrassed, ashamed, maybe guilty. It can be really difficult to admit that, especially in a society that might consider some of those emotions to signal weakness or powerlessness. You know, nobody wants to feel that. And so the danger there is that we can end up suppressing how we truly feel. And if we're suppressing consistently, we're not giving our time space, our body's space, and our mind space to just release that emotion, right? And kind of move on. So ultimately, in doing this, I think that, you know, you might want to share it with people, but again, it's so empowering to kind of journal and kind of give yourself that space and permission, right? To acknowledge to yourself what you're feeling. Okay, so next I want to talk about self-management, and it is the ability to control or redirect disruptive impulses and moods, and also the propensity to suspend judgment and think before acting. So as you guys might be able to see, I hope that you can kind of make the connection between those previous activities and this skill. I definitely think that those activities can kind of help us build on this in particular. But self-management is kind of the next dimension in Goleman's EQ inventory. I think that emotional resilience is actually really similar to the regulation or management that I talked about. And emotional resilience is the ability to adapt and cope with adversity. And I wanted to show you guys this diagram because it shows us the difference between our parasympathetic and our sympathetic nervous system. So whenever we're triggered by something negative, our bodies jump in an instant into this fight or flight mode. I know many of you have probably heard of this, but there are really physiological symptoms that come from that sympathetic nervous system activation. So your heartbeat, you know, your heart might start racing, right? You might feel tightness in your stomach. Your mouth might get dry, you know, your pupils are dilated. So those are all signals that your body is launching into fight or flight mode. I think what's interesting about parasympathetic versus our sympathetic nervous system is that whereas we know that our sympathetic nervous system is activated in seconds, and it makes sense, right? You know, we have to react to survive, theoretically, right? So we're wired to kick that in immediately. And our body's really ramping us up so that we can run or we can, you know, meet the occasion and fight through it. But compare that instantaneous sympathetic nervous system activation with what some researchers and experts would say that or estimate that 15 minutes that takes to kind of shift from that sympathetic nervous system to the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is really where our bodies are in a state of calmness. Our heartbeat becomes a lot slower. Our body is regulated, right? We're resting and digesting. That's another way of kind of terming this state. And this is really where we're coming from, a place of peace, of groundedness, of reason. And so as I'll kind of discuss a little bit more, is the ultimate goal in building our emotional resilience, our ability to adapt and cope, is to slow ourselves down, right? We don't want to act out of that fight or flight state. We really want our bodies to come to a place of calmness and level-headedness, and that's where we can kind of best address those challenges or adversity or even feelings of uncertainty, right, and confusion. So the objective is to slow down. And what's really cool is that some of these practices that I'm sharing with you is the more researchers have found that the more we actually practice those things, the more we can actually shorten that time that it takes for us to really get calm. Okay, so a few tips for increasing our emotional resilience. Just want to start by saying, you know, the same way that we are vulnerable to catching a biological virus if we don't take care of ourselves, We are also more sensitive to catching others' bad moods if we don't build up our own personal reservoirs. So it's really, really so important that we take our self-care seriously. So this includes our body, mind, and spirit. I like to think of it this way. But we know that we're multifaceted, right? So taking care of our body means that we have to exercise. Taking care of our spirit means, maybe spending time with people that we care about, people that reflect our values back to us. Maybe this involves, praying, taking a moment to get in touch with yourself. It could be meditation, it could be reflection. When it comes to our mental and emotional space, that's where I think the journaling, maybe you have an affirmation practice, the therapy that really comes into play. And going back to body, right? It's not just exercise, it's also diet, so eating a balanced meal, eating regularly, and also getting regular sleep. And I wanted to kind of separate these components to just demonstrate again that it is a full system. That's what we're operating with. And so it's so important that we take care and attend to all three of these areas, right? Not just one. I think that one thing that's really unique to what we're experiencing right now is that sometimes, or for some of us, our transitions are lost, right? So the time that you are taking to commute to work, for people who are working from home, you kind of lost that time that you might need to wind down or just take a minute to be by yourself, right? And so I think it's so important to kind of set boundaries. That might mean, taking a walk after work, even if, finishing your workday looks like pressing an X on a dialog box on your computer. It could mean sitting outside on the patio for a few minutes. It could mean, taking a shower, taking a bath. So, really embracing the symbolism of cleansing yourself from the stress of the day. So all of those are really good practices to help us kind of set boundaries, right? We don't want to take all of the stress from work back to our families and, just continue our lives in that way. So it can be useful to kind of embrace those transitions. Also, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's so important to, be supportive to each other, especially the people that we love in our lives, right? Because so many of us are struggling with more and more challenges. But in being compassionate and offering that emotional support, it's so important to remind ourselves not to carry other people's emotional baggage and pain with us, right? So for that time that you're with your friend, you're with your parents, you're with, your loved ones, you want to be present. You want to, create a space so that they feel as though you're really there for them. But after that meeting is over, after the Zoom call is off, after you're done hanging out with them, it's really important to release that, and reset. And so I think that so many of us, can forget that. And it's easy to do. It's easy to forget that. Also, setting boundaries for emotional intake. So this could just look like being clear on what you want to allow into your life, because again, I hope that you've seen from the presentation that, these things do affect us more than we often realize. And so I know for me, we're at a time where, there's videos that are being circulated. Some of them are violent, right? I know for me, I can't handle it. And so I refuse to watch any video that, has any type of violence in it. At the same time, a personal value of mine is to be politically informed, politically engaged. And so I make sure that each day I spend time reading the news. I make sure that I pair, my information with specific action, right? So it's important to me to educate myself when it comes to to voting. It's important to me to get connected with local organizations that are doing work that I believe in, right? So all of those things are ways for me to act on my values without passively consuming information constantly, right? And feeling like I need to do that. So that's a boundary for emotional intake that I practice, and yours might look similar or different, right? But I think it's important to be clear on where are your boundaries. We all could use some. Also, that could just mean, you know, setting a time frame or setting time limits. So if you have a friend who is really going through something, right, you might say, let's have a weekly phone date, let's have a weekly meetup, right? And you know that you're providing that consistency for your friend. It's somebody that you care about, but you don't have to talk to that person every single day, right? Same thing with, as I mentioned, like news intake, for instance. It's so easy to just mindlessly scroll through social media, constantly taking in information, constantly taking in people's emotions. But I really try to catch myself. I have a problem with this sometimes, but I try to really limit that to a couple of hours per day, right? I think any more, I know for myself, means that I'm not going to show up as effectively. Okay, so another practice that I wanted to share that I think is particularly relevant now is shifting your mindset. So I think that because, you know, we're in an unprecedented situation, it can be very easy to feel overwhelmed. And for some of us, it might be difficult to think of ourselves as people who can really get through this time of uncertainty, right? So for those of us that are struggling with seeing ourselves as resilient, as strong, as able to overcome whatever challenges we're going through at this point in time, one really useful and I think empowering practice is to write down and tell someone you trust a story about your coping and resilience. So in this story, you want to include the challenges you faced, what you did to overcome them, who helped you, and what did you learn about yourself in the process? And in doing these things, we're actually able to see ourselves as resources and also strong and capable of taking action and generating solutions. So, one thing that I didn't talk about as much, but is definitely true based on our research, is that positive contagion is infectious as well. So as a leader in whatever capacity that looks like for you, it's important to act as a thermostat and not just a thermometer, meaning you really can embrace your role as an emotional barometer. And the way that you kind of show up for your team, for your coworkers, can really set the temperature or tone for everyone, right? And you can choose to do that versus just reflecting back whatever it is that you're picking up on. You might want to leverage power poses. So this is another thing that I didn't speak much about, but is also really, really useful, is Amy Cuddy has actually shown us that through her research, that the way that we carry ourselves really affects our brain chemistry. So if I have my shoulders back, if I'm standing up straight, you know, my head, my chin is up, right? I'm being expansive, I'm taking up space. Because those are all bodily postures that indicate power, I'm going to show up feeling a greater sense of power. I'm going to feel confident. I'm going to have courage, right? I'm going to feel as though I can generate solutions to whatever it is that we're working on. So that can be a really powerful, quick practice for us to keep in mind. Also, using uncertainty to create possibilities. So I know that, you know, for so many of us, uncertainty is something that is creating fear right now. But it's important to remember that with uncertainty, it's also indicating possibilities. So I think we can use that feeling of uncertainty as a cue to start thinking through, you know, actions, solutions. What can I do with this? Also, or finally, I think it's important to think about what kinds of contagion do you enjoy. So this might sound like a weird question because I know I've spent the whole presentation mostly focused on negative contagion. And when we think about contagion, right, it might feel icky, something that we don't want to catch, right? But again, we are social beings, transmitting feelings, sharing feelings. Those are things that we really enjoy. We're wired to seek that out. They're things that, create meaning for us. So we can actually use our knowledge of the effectiveness of positive contagion and use that knowledge to transmit feelings of empowerment, maybe even healing. And one way to approach this is to ask yourself, what is it that you want and need during this time, right? What kinds of emotions are you yearning for? And we can use that as an answer, use that answer as a guidepost to spread more positive emotions like warmth, love, joy, enthusiasm. And we know that that's a powerful practice because whatever it is that we put out, we'll receive in return. So thank you.
This has been, just wonderful. I've got so much written down here, and I love that you have given us some solid strategies on how to deal with emotional contagion and the power of negative emotions effect on us. But there are a few questions. Do you mind if I go ahead and throw these at you?
Yeah, sure.
So the first one is, you mentioned emotional quotient, or EQ. Is there a test or some way to find out where you are on the emotional quotient scale or spectrum?
Yeah. Yes. So as I mentioned, Daniel Goleman developed this concept of EQ, and there are actually quite a few different versions or variations of this test. And the basic dimensions, as I mentioned, are self-management, self-awareness, social awareness, and relationship management. And you can kind of reflect on where you are in those and kind of get an estimate for where you are from an EQ perspective. But I have my own version that I think is actually really succinct and really is an accurate reflection of those dimensions. So if you want to send me an email, if you're interested, I would love to share that test with you. It's actually something that I do all the time with my students, and it's great to see how insightful it can be for people.
Well, listen, I'm first on the list. Send that to me right away. Yes. And then some more questions. So you mentioned a lot of strategies to practice and to put into place. In particular, the body scan is one you mentioned. Someone asked, when should I practice these? When is the best time to put this into action?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I would really say that I am a huge advocate of having daily rituals. And, I won't claim that I'm 100% perfect at this. I sometimes forget. But when it comes to meditation, when it comes to just having quiet time to kind of check in with yourself, see how you're feeling, even journaling, it's something that can be really effective if you know you're coming back to it on a daily basis. So I would say as much as possible.
That is good. And then this is the last question, because of time, and there's so much more. If you have more questions, can they email you and ask you
Oh
directly?
yeah,
Do you mind
please.
that? So
Yes,
folks, we
please.
can't get to every question, but please email Dr. Forrester. She is happy to answer those for you. Here's the last question. How do I handle consistently negative people?
Yeah, that's a great one too. So there are actually a few things. So I would say that, establishing those boundaries is one really good first step, especially if someone is repeatedly showing that they tend to, emit negativity, right? But it's also tough. So I would say if this is someone that, you're around frequently, maybe a coworker, maybe a boss, someone that you spend a lot of time with, one thing that you can try is really just actively countering that. And because you know that this person has a tendency towards certain emotions in particular, you can even brainstorm, right? A lot of us don't often prepare for social interactions, but that can actually be something that is very effective, right? And so if there's a tendency to kind of complain about a report, you can just come in and know that you want to actively set the tone. And so you can counter that emotion by really focusing and emphasizing the positive of whatever the task or situation might be. And we've seen that, again, positive contagion is infectious too. So if you're expressive enough, you might be able to kind of turn that person over to the positive side.
That is so good. I never thought of the idea of preparing for a social interaction. So brainstorming in advance how you want this interaction to go and how you want it to be, and then come in and set the stage for what you've already brainstormed and what you prepared for.
Yeah.
That is such a great idea. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for sharing all of this insight with us. I certainly appreciate it, and I know the folks watching have appreciated it as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope that everyone picked up a tip or two, and it's been a pleasure to share this.
Absolutely. And let me say thank you to the folks that are watching us. Thank you for joining us once again in the Mercer University Professional Development Series. This has been absolutely fascinating. We want you to join us again. Come back next week. We'll be talking with Dr. Jody Blank as we talk about privacy and data protection online, another very interesting and controversial topic. So Dr. Blank will lead us in that. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful, wonderful week, and we'll see you again soon. Bye, folks.